extreme polarization between the ultra-wealthy and the poor, the advent of AI.
These are the right challenges for people.
Very significant issues that we all in this world face today.
What does it take to lead one of the most transformative banks in the world through a decade of growth, navigate a global expansion into China, and build a culture that inspires people to achieve extraordinary results? Ken Wilcox, former CEO of Silicon Valley Bank, has done it all. In this episode, he shares the untold stories behind his leadership journey, the challenges of adapting to radically different cultures, and why putting people first is the secret, you guess what, to lasting success. So, believe me, that's a conversation you are going to love it. So, let's start.
If there are two people that are not succeeding together and one of them is you, somebody's got to change. You better decide it's going to be you.
You led Silicon Valley Bank. So what were the key leadership lessons you learned during that time?
It was faced with a couple of very serious problems. The strategy that our bank had pursued was no longer workable.
How did your leadership style evolve? Context in a place like China, which is very different.
The biggest problem that most Western CEOs have when they go to China. One day my assistant, he looked at me and he says, "You are never going to be successful in China." And I thought, "Well, why not?" And he said, "Because you've got a bad habit. You always say..."
Hi everyone and welcome back to a new episode of The World Class Leaders. So today I'm in a very good company, so I have a pleasure to have with me Kenneth Wilcox. And Kenneth worked at Silicon Valley Bank from 1990 through 2019. And from 2001 through 2010, he served as a CEO. In that role, he successfully pursued a strategy of global expansion. In 2011, he and his wife moved to China, where he both founded and served as a CEO SVB, and SVB looked like in Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, and Suzhou. So primarily in developing the Chinese business. And at the end of 2014, he returned back to Silicon Valley, where he lives at the moment. And he remained on the board of the bank in China as a vice chair till the end of 2018. He's also an adjunct professor now, a member of the International Advisory Board of Fudan University in Shanghai, and is currently teaching entrepreneurship and leadership at the UC Berkeley. Then, and that's the reason why inviting Ken on the show, in January 2020, he published Leading Through Culture, How Real Leaders Create Cultures That Motivate People to Achieve Great Things. And his second book, The China Business Conundrum, Ensure That the Win-Win Doesn't Mean Western Companies Lose Twice, then will be really published, in this really moment, by Wiley. So, Ken, thank you so much for being on the show with me.
Thanks for having me.
So, Ken, I want to go straight into, the typical question I have for everybody who comes on the show, and I'm looking for a very short answer is, what does it truly mean to be a CEO, given your experience, but now in 2025? And what aspect of this role do people really often misunderstand and overlook?
Being a CEO in 2025 means all the things that it meant in 2024 and before, but with the addition of the, I would say, very significant issues that we all in this world face today. I think of those from my own perspective as, first of all, the geopolitical tensions, which are many and great. Secondly, within the U.S., the extreme polarization between the ultra-wealthy and the, I would say, in relative terms, poor. And third, global warming, which is an issue for all of us around the world. And if you need a fourth, I would say the advent of AI.
Yes.
So there are a lot of things for people to think about.
Totally get it. I think these are the right challenges for people to think about. And whatever is happening in the US has, of course, an impact on anybody else that is not based in the US.
A highly interrelated world.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Especially these days. So I'm interested, you led Silicon Valley Bank through a transformative decade. So expanding globally while staying true to core niches like tech, life science, and venture capital. So what were the key leadership lessons you learned during that time? And how did you approach balancing innovation with focus? I mean, that's super interesting to understand. What does it mean, leading in a global world from your experience with Silicon Valley Bank?
Well, let me just begin my answer to that question by saying that when I inherited the position in 2001. So I was at Silicon Valley Bank for almost 30 years. I was only CEO for 10, 01 through 10. When I got into that position, I was faced with a couple of very serious problems. One was the dot-com debacle, meaning the recession in the US that was caused by the dot-com debacle started literally the same month I became CEO. And the other big issue for me to face was that the strategy that our bank had pursued heretofore was no longer workable. Prior to 2001, when I became CEO, we had what we called the three-legged stool strategy. A third of our portfolio was technology, but a third was real estate development, and another third was small business. And I made the decision almost immediately upon assuming the position that we needed to exit the real estate area as well as the small business area, for the simple reason that there were thousands of other banks in the US that did exactly that same thing. And we were simply a Me Too player. But in technology, we were unique. Virtually the only bank in the country that was dedicating significant resources to technology. So we exited 2/3 and refilled it with technology. And the one other thing that I did in that first couple of years was to take the bank global. Prior to that, we'd been domestic. But technology is a global industry. You have to be everywhere.
My takeaway from what you said is you essentially repositioning what the bank was looking for. And the move to technology has been critical for the success of the bank, but also critical for the expansion. But technology has allowed the bank to, probably easier, I would say, to start really a global expansion. That's why that became, one of your priorities.
That's exactly right. And then, of course, to have it happen at exactly the moment that the technology recession began, it was a kind of an unfortuitous combination.
Yeah, it's interesting. In that perspective, is there any, and we'll go through the conversation primarily meaning, discussing about the expansion to China, what does it mean, for leaders. But what are some lessons that after many years, you will draw from these couple of things that you just said in terms of, the lessons are, be focused on what matters. So, less is more, clear. Technology is enabler, clear. But if we go a little bit deeper, so what is really, below the surface, there is a lesson for you, for leaders now that are listening and say, okay, I want to do the same thing. I want to globalize my company. I want to be much more focused. What people probably should also consider to do that?
Well, I think it's very delicate, and it's not an easy thing to go about doing for a couple of different reasons. On the one hand, you have to balance focus with flexibility.
Yes.
And in some sense, they're almost the opposite ends of a spectrum. And I think it's very difficult to tread the tight wire between focus and flexibility. Another thing is that you have got to be decisive without being the sole decision maker, because there's no single person that can make all of the decisions. And in any case, when you do make decisions, it's important to consult your direct reports, your experts, and people who know how the troops will respond to a decision. So there's a balancing act there as well.
I love it. So it's balance and is inclusion. So it's involving people in the process. It don't be too much directive and then say, oh, that's what we're going to do. So it's bring them, with you in the decision, that you are taking as a leader. That's my understanding.
And there's one other balancing act I forgot to mention, and that is that people need constant reassurance.
Right.
But you can't pretend that you know exactly how things are going to come out either, because that lacks authenticity. So the balance between reassurance, but admitting that you can't tell the future with certainty.
Agreed. And by the way, one of the things I noticed, in my work with ECO is CEOs, they don't always have the answer. And sometimes, either they want to demonstrate that they have the answers, but they don't really have them, or sometimes they're much more vulnerable and they get their team, the best possible team around them, so people that can really inform them what are the right decisions to make. Is this something that you face, given the massive change that you made when you became a CEO, this focus and globalizing the brand? Did you feel at any point that you did not have all the answer, but you trust your team and you involved in that when, the right answer came to you? You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. I do. I understand that completely. And yes, of course, you have to have, however, for that to work well, you have to have a team that you actually trust. And trust takes two forms, I think. One, there's the obvious. You trust somebody based on whether or not they're really an honest person of good character, but that's not really what I'm referring to. I'm referring to trust in the sense that you share values with your
Yes.
team and that you believe fervently in their competence. And if you don't have that kind of a team, you need to acquire one before you can really make progress.
Yeah, that's such an excellent point. Love it. Okay, great. So let's move a little bit more, through your experience. And as we said in the introduction, that you moved to China to set the business there, and to found and lead as SVB, you enter, clearly in a very different culture and business environment, and which I don't think is uncommon these days for those people that have a global brand, companies they're operating in different parts of the world. I had my own personal experience been very international. So I worked many, many years in different cultures all over the world. And I learned so many things that really shaped me as an individual, not only as a leader. So I'm interested. So how did your leadership style evolve to align with the culture and context in a place like China, which is very different than the Western, country society, but also the way our organization work really. So what insights can global leaders can take from your experience in leading in a new, totally different culture?
I think that the biggest problem that most, let me say, Western CEOs, and maybe I should narrow the scope to American CEOs, have when they go to China is that China is, relative to what we know and are familiar with in the United States, a lot more different in multiple ways than almost any other country in which we operate. And the problem is that all of us as humans, we depend on what I call mental models. And that is, based on our experience, we create models or theories of the way the world works. And when I take those mental models to other places, if I take them to the UK, my mental models, I can superimpose them on the UK. And for the most part, they fit, not 100%. And the same would be true in many European countries. China, we've also spent a lot of time in India as a bank.
Right.
And actually many other countries. China is the most different for us.
Okay.
And we make the mistake of carrying these mental models to China and superimposing them. And then rather than realizing they don't fit, we come to erroneous conclusions about what we're seeing and what's actually transpiring. That, I think, is the biggest stumbling block. I know I spent several years in Germany, and there's a phrase that people use in German that I think applies so nicely, and that is that you can't jump over your own shadow. I think that explains why we miss the mark so often in China.
Give me some example of some mental models that you needed to change or shape, in the transition when you started to lead in China.
Let me give you a couple of obvious ones. You'll probably say to yourself, well, that's so obvious. I don't know why that confused you. But here in the United States, we operate, and many people understand the United States is so big that many people operate within the United States their entire life and haven't had a significant exposure to other places like China. Here in the United States, we very definitely, in the world of business, tend to historically think of businesses here And government is here. And never the twain shall meet unless we absolutely have to.
Of course.
We don't typically like dealing with government. And then, of course, party is an altogether different thing. When I started living in China, of course, at an intellectual level, I knew this the whole time, but at an emotional, at a gut level, I had to learn that when I was talking with most of my conversation partners, they were neither approaching the conversation as business people or as government officials or as party members. They were approaching the encounter as all three simultaneously, to the extent that they themselves didn't even differentiate between them. And then on the surface, that seems, well, that's obvious. Anybody could tell that. Just read a book about China. But experiencing it and
It's different.
understanding it and what impact that's having is a totally different situation.
So it's a way, in other words, understanding. I mean, look, the real question is even a bigger question than business and leadership. That is more about how the society operates and how people they tend to fit into specific roles that society creates for them, and they feel like they need to operate inside of that frame, right?
Right.
So, in other words, is it fair to say that your, and by the way, I love it, the approach that worked for you was, instead of going to China with some sort of prevalidated and fixed mental frame about how things they're supposed to be, you be much more open-minded to say, okay, well, that's the model that worked there in my own country in the US, but here in China, I want to be open to understand how different models can be created based on the circumstances that they're going to show up in front of me as I move forward. Is that
That's
fair
true.
summary?
That's very fair. Let me add one sentence to that, and that is that it's really, really important to achieve a balance between being judgmental on the one hand and adhering to your own personal values on the other hand. So,
Yes.
in other words, one thing that happens in China all the time is that you are subjected to situations in which you are tempted to violate the American Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In other words, engage in behavior that is tantamount to a conflict of interest. To be simple, accepting large gifts or accepting things that you really shouldn't, because from a U.S. point of view, it's illegal. On the other hand, you can't face those situations by being judgmental, because you're not going to change anything. You'll alienate people and you'll misinterpret their intention. So I do think it's very difficult.
It is. And yeah, and I was reflecting what you said, from my personal experience. And I did not work in Asia, but I work a lot in Africa. And in Africa, for me, it's different, but there are some similarities in terms of, for example, the relation with, gift, just to be very specific, and how things work in a country where, from one end, you need to stay true to yourself and to your level of morality and integrity and ethics, and, you name it, but at the same time, to be able to adapt in the current context, because otherwise things are not moving forward. Do you remember one specific moment when you felt like, you made it, something changed in your approach? Say, okay, you know what? I think I know now how to make these things work in China. There is a moment or an event, something like that.
Well, there's so many of them. It was a constant learning experience. And actually, the so-called old China hands, I did business in China for almost 25 years, but we only lived there for 4.
Right.
The people you refer to as old China hands typically have lived there for 20 plus, and they'll admit that the longer they live there, the more confused they get. But I can mention many moments, but one in particular has always stood out in my mind, and that was up in the first year, toward the end of the first year. One day, my assistant, who was a wonderful assistant, of course, he was Chinese, because all of our employees were Chinese. We only had, I think, 2 Western employees out of 300.
Right.
And he was really exasperated with me. And he looked at me and he says, Ken, you are never going to be successful in China. A little bit dumbfounded by that blanket statement. And I said, why not? And he said, because you've got a bad habit. You always say what you mean and you mean what you say. That's not what we do here. And then suddenly a light went off like, oh my God, maybe I am going about this the wrong way. I actually, over time, developed a practice that I would recommend to almost anybody, in China anyway. And that is that I always had, and they were the same too, I kept them for years, 2 translators with me at all times. And they traded off roles, but one of them was always there to translate. And the other one was, because my Chinese was not very good, and the other one was there to take notes on what he thought the people who were speaking actually meant. So we would, the 3 of us, after almost every meeting, would have a short meeting, and they would explain to me what was actually meant by what was being said. So it's not just a direct translation. It's what's the underlying sentiment? What are they driving? What are they telling me? Because sometimes it would be easy from my point of view to think they were telling me one thing when in point of fact, they were telling me something different.
I think it's such a great approach to, by the way, to leadership that goes even beyond, being a great leader, in a specific country. Meaning, if you have this approach of being much more intentional in what you are listening for and trying to see what are the words that are not necessarily said because they still live in the foreground and they're not expressed, I think it gives you different power, because you need to be driven by curiosity. You're going to start reading more and learning more from people that goes even beyond what they say. I think it's a fantastic way to force ourselves to listen better and more, and to reflect more what people really say or actually they don't say, right?
Yeah. There's another thing that I did. Actually, I've done it even in the U.S., but it's something I would recommend to people. And that is, in a sense, you could call it journaling, but I'm not really a journalist. In the evening, before I went to sleep, I often, not every night, but often would take notes on what were the challenges that I was facing and how would I propose going about addressing them.
Great.
And then every couple of months, I would read through the last couple of months and try to figure out whether or not I had been going in a wrong direction, and there was maybe a course correction to take place. The other thing that I did that I thought was very useful was I was able to establish relationships with 3 or 4 venture capitalists. They're a part of our business, but 3 or 4 really very well-known venture capitalists with whom I'd had contact over many, many years, but they were in China. I turned them into my so-called secret, although nothing's a secret in China, so-called secret advisory board. And I would meet with them every couple of months in another city. And this was not a marketing effort. Most advisory boards are marketing efforts, fundamentally. But This was, I really want to know what you think. And I'd tell them what my problems were, actual tangible issues involving my interactions with my business partners in China, and ask them, what am I doing that you think I should do differently? And they gave me, fortunately, I landed on 3 or 4 people that were, I believe, quite straightforward with me and quite honest with me. They would criticize me. They'd say, the way you're handling that is not smart. It's not going to work here in China. You need to do this instead, or that instead. And that was of such great use to me. I would go back, change my behavior, and voila, all of a sudden things started to work again.
And that leads me to the next question. We touched on how to adapt business wise and as well with your lessons leadership wise to China and to cultures that are very different. But clearly, for many people in the audience, the question is, if they are still with us in this episode, they are more interested. Okay, but how can I develop business in China, or how can I develop business partnership, meaningful relationship, so I can scale my business in countries? Let's go even beyond China. In countries, they are very different than my own country culturally, but it's critical for them to grow, right? And how can you create this partnership? I mean, you just mentioned a nice story about you created or you've been part of this sort of advisory board that was created that give you better understanding how to deal with a situation. I'm sure that could be one of the strategies, but there are any other strategies that can really help to create this meaningful partnership to create success overseas in new countries?
Well, that's a very, very broad question, but let me do my best. I think that one of the things that is important is I'll mention two that I think are of utmost importance. One of them is to take what I call the scientific method to understanding this new culture that you're finding yourself in. And by scientific method, I mean develop observe what's going on around you and develop I'll call it, for want of a better term, a theory, a working hypothesis. What explains what I just experienced and observed? And then test that in the next few weeks. Ask yourself, am I really on target or am I misinterpreting things? Do I need a different working hypothesis to explain what's going on around me? And slowly you build an ever more accurate model in your mind of how this thing works here. Another thing is to figure out how people build relationships in the environment in which you're operating, because people build relationships differently in different countries, and relationships mean something different, I think, in different countries. So I spent several years in Germany as well. I would say that the nature of relationships in Germany is somewhat different from the nature of relationships in China. And so you have to understand how those relationships are built and then go about building them in the way that is consistent with the place in which you're operating right now. China is very, I would say in general, I realize we can't make sweeping generalizations about whole cultures, but China, for various reasons, is, when sociologists analyze different cultures, it's fairly low on the trust scale. In other words, trust between people is not high.
Yes.
So in order to compensate for that, people began building relationships that in Chinese we refer to as guanqi. But if you just translate that as relationship, it might mislead you because there are relationships in every country. But in China, there's a very specific formula almost. Guanqi is a matter, I want to build a relationship with you because you could be important to me. And you see a relationship with me as one that could be important to you. And so we slowly over time, you don't do it overnight, slowly over time, we do favors for each other. It's a tit for tat. It's a quid pro quo. And if we do that over a long enough time, maybe, a matter of many months at least, maybe of a few years, we begin to develop a certain amount of trust in each other, meaning we know we can count on the other person. It doesn't mean that I, like you tremendously or you me, but we begin to believe we can count on each other. And that ends up being the basic building block, I think, in Chinese business relationships. It's a little bit different because, here in the U.S., when I meet people in business, I seldom give them a gift, and it's not very often they give me a gift. It's confusing when you start living in China and every time you meet with somebody, they give you a gift. And you can tell by the look in their eyes, they're kind of expecting you're going to give them one too. It's not the gift it's the gift giving that is the big deal. And sometimes the gifts get more and more expensive over time. And sometimes they are really outrageously expensive. But and it's again, it's not the gift giving even. It's the I know I can count on this person, and I think it may sound obvious. It's not obvious, and it's different enough that if you don't learn to do it the way it's done there, I think you won't make progress in the same way that you would otherwise.
Yeah, and by the way, I don't think it's obvious. And I mean, what you just talked, I think is a great indication how, you know, again, society works and the expectations they are created. And if you really want to, fit in, as we used to say, you have to meet, these expectations. And even if they're politely, or sometimes they're a little bit subtle, but the reality is there are some expectations that we need to consider when we want to operate in these countries. That remind me as well what happens in the Middle East, right? Middle East is maybe it's different because there are no gifts. But I worked many years in the Middle East. Is you be a relation by spending a lot of time with with the local, just sitting together and having a coffee together, stay there together, and maybe longer, maybe waiting while the local is on the phone and you're just waiting. It doesn't look very respectful, but that's how it works there. It's a sort of unsaid expectations about a relation needs to be created and built. But what I really loved about your example about relationship created, by the way, it looks like a little bit transactional, right? Because I'm gonna create a relation because I need you, and you're gonna respond if you need me. So it looks transactional, but if we want to see from a different angle, it looks also a mutual commitment to create something together, which I think is fair. I mean,
That's true,
it's
right? And
committed to create something together.
you're getting at another aspect of it. It's not good to be judgmental about these things. It's not good to say, "Oh,
Yeah,
well, they're just transactional." So I don't
yeah,
really like
exactly.
that. You have to say, "This is the way it's done here," and don't apply adjectives that are judgmental because you may be dead wrong. They're not seeing it that way.
Yes. And again, it's a fantastic example or demonstration that when you really live and work with an open mind, so these things become a byproduct of your curiosity and no byproduct of your judgments, which to me
You're.
give you.
Oh, I just did the interrupting. I wanted to add something though because you mentioned the Middle East, and you remind me of something. When I was in my early 20s, I worked for a while on a freighter, and for various reasons, probably because I was a so-called college kid, I didn't garner a lot of respect. People just referred to me as the darn college kid. And the
Right.
only people that would associate with me were four guys from Yemen. They were the only Middle Easterners on the ship. And they were the darn Yemenis, and I was the darn college kid. And so one of them, a guy named Mugbel Akahali, spent all of his time with me. And there were times when I would say, Mugbel, why don't you go do your own thing? Why do you always want to spend all your time with me? We get off the ship in a port and you'll do exactly what I want to do. And why don't you do what you want to do? He said, because we're building a friendship. And friends are people who spend time with each other and appreciate what the other person likes to do and does it with them. And I think that corresponds more or less to what you're saying, but
Yeah.
obviously at a different context, different level. But
No,
it's
no. Yeah.
also a different approach, I think, a different way of thinking.
Yeah. Look, one thing I always say to leaders is, and I think it's a great reminder for everybody, and I think it fits nicely with the conversation we have been having, is always meet people where they are and not where you are.
Yeah.
And I think it give you access to a different thinking, to creating something, together, to stopping entertaining all the biases that you have about things. It give you access to something more powerful. And if you are a leader, if you are in a leadership position, I think it give you a lot of
I
valid
think that's
way.
exactly right, what you just
Yeah.
said. Yeah.
Yeah. which is, I mean, seems to be there's been your success strategy when you were there. It sounds like based on how you are telling the story, it sounds like that actually you did exactly that, which to me is it speaks highly about you and your approach that was clearly successful. And that I think is a great segue for the new book that that you've wrote, China Business Conundrum. Um, we spoke already a little bit about the complexity of doing, business in China. The typical challenge of dealing with government, with the society, society, and we discussed a little bit about that. We don't have the time to go deeper, of course, but people will have access to your book to go more into that. I'm just interested in whether you can share some sort of, from what you wrote, something meaningful for Western leaders. They are listening right now. Could be CEOs or people they are responsible for driving business in China. What are something they need to consider on top of what we already discussed? Like, okay, in the next 3-6 months, I want to get some sort of early wins, good, traction. What people really should start doing?
Well, let me answer that in a slightly different way, but I think this is a very good example for you. And that is that one of the most significant differences between China and the US, in my experience anyway, is a different approach to negotiation. Almost everybody in my age bracket, and I believe younger, not everybody, but most people, learned their negotiation skills in seminars here in the US that were put on by people who were basing their approach on a book called Getting to Yes.
Right.
And that book is a byproduct of something called the Harvard Negotiation Project. It took place many years ago.
Right.
And so we always, not everybody, I'll admit, but most people, when they negotiate, they try to figure out what are your needs and disclose these are my needs. How do we work together, come up with a solution that's going to make both of us relatively happy? And when they get to China, they realize that nobody studied Getting to Yes. That's not the basis of negotiations in China. They have a totally different approach to negotiations. And you may not like it as much, or you may find it frustrating, but you have to learn how it works. And it is different. It is definitely different. I would say if you were to try to reduce it to just a sentence or two, and you can't reduce anything to a sentence or two, really, but you'd say the negotiation in China is based on leverage. We try to figure out what your leverage is, and we try to figure out what my leverage is, and each of us tries to maintain our leverage, grow our leverage, and apply our leverage in a way that will get us what we want. And it is just a different model. But if you're used to the Getting to Yes model, first of all, you will royally screw up. Secondly, you will probably be perceived as not knowing what you're doing, or either as being naive or potentially as being deceitful.
Yes.
I think people have to be successful over time in China. You have to learn to negotiate the way they negotiate. I think you also have to start with the premise that if there are two people that are not succeeding together and one of them is you, somebody's got to change, and you better decide it's going to be you, because you can't change another person.
No, you
much
can't.
less the whole society.
Exactly right. So you can't really do that. So great. We said about negotiation, the way how you negotiate is massively important to create level of traction in business when you work with Chinese clients, individuals, etc. And then, you mentioned about, the last point about changing people. Any other tip? I mean, we discussed earlier about relationship, how create the right relation with Chinese people. That was a fantastic and practical example. Any other things that you explain in your book that can facilitate or speed up a win-win relation between the Western leaders and the Chinese leaders?
Well, it goes back a little to what you were saying. I think you were saying a little earlier about understanding where the other party is coming from.
Yes,
The worldview in China is different from the worldview in the
totally,
US.
totally.
And if we don't understand the worldview, we can become frustrated even to the point of being annoyed by behavior that's based on assumptions and that are fundamentally different from ours. But if you can't think about it that way, if you can't, if you're incapable of trying to figure out what their assumptions are, you can't understand their behavior. And we have a totally different set of assumptions. And of course, I think my assumptions are more accurate than other people's, but they're thinking the same thing. So I think that stubbornly clinging to your own and refusing to understand the other person's assumptions is just going to result in frustration all the way around. So that's it. I would recommend to anybody who's going to try to do business in China that they put some serious effort into reading some history and understand the last couple of 100 years, maybe even the last couple of thousand, although that's not quite so important as the past couple of hundred. So you understand what people believe in China and how that compares to what people believe here. And, talk about American exceptionalism. I think we know what we think that is. There's something called that I would refer to as Chinese exceptionalism too. And if you don't understand that, God help you.
Yeah, and you did not say that explicitly, but I can feel that potentially there is a much broader perception about from American leaders, to maybe driven a little bit more by let's call it arrogance, to believe that the American version of the truth is the best possible truth. And to me, that's easy disempowering. That's disempowering any relationship, anything that you want to do. So I think that's such a great reminder. And by the way, what you shared is a principle that applies to everybody in every part of the world, even in your own country. Because if you don't appreciate, because inside of US and America there are so many different cultures in one single nation. So
we're
there
multiple
are
countries in one.
exactly. So the same approach that you apply potentially to China, you should apply it to your own country, etc. Because I think to me is a mindset and leadership 101 is people really behave based on how they see the world. And if you're not able or not interested to see something different in your world, or you're going to always see the same world, you're going to always operate, from that and not from something different. So I think it's such a great lesson.
Well, I think it's also the probably most significant problem we have in the U.S. today is that you say there are multiple cultures in the U.S. There definitely are, and we really don't understand each other and aren't trying hard enough.
Yes. And I can see that. And I would say from my experience, Kenny, is when people feel more pressure in any shape or form, stress, pressure, sense of survival, our ability to see the world in a different way diminishes anyway. So I think that is an interesting dynamics why sometimes we feel even less able to look at what is not apparent in front of us when we are operating from a position of survival and not from empowerment.
I think that's really, really true. Yeah.
Amazing. Ken, look, in the last maybe minutes, tell us a little bit more about your new book, Ken, where people can find it and where people should find you if they want to make a contact.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, this new book, which actually only came out less than a month ago now. It's published by Wiley. It's available at Barnes and Nobles. It's available on Amazon. It's available at books.com. And it's really and truly focused on understanding China and giving some, I think, advice on how to optimize your attempts to do well in China. And I think it's a valuable book. Of course, you expect me to say that I wrote it, but one of the reasons that I think it's valuable is there are lots of books about China being published around the world. So, but there are very, very few books by business people. And in my experience, all the books have some value, but lack of books written by business people represents a significant gap, and it needs to be filled.
Agreed. Well, great. Ken, where people should go if they want to contact you directly? What's the best way for people?
People can always use LinkedIn if they enjoy that. I welcome emails. So my email address would be useful as well.
Yeah, we'll add it to the show notes.
Thank
Amazing.
you.
Ken,
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It was really, really insightful. And we share a common view about cultural leadership. So that's great. So again, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Good luck.